and we are here in our beautiful black Mercedes V-Class van to do the digital confession drive. Right here next to me is Johann Jenson of Hilti, and he's and again I have to remember the title correctly, Global Head of Digital Customer Experience. I really learned that throughout the last 2 days. Thanks for joining me, and so to give our listeners and the audience an idea of who you are, might just give a short intro about yourself.
Cool. Yeah. Thanks for having me. This is cool. I'm looking forward to seeing the tour of Cologne while we drive around. So I'm working with Hilti for the past year and a half, and what I do at Hilti is I try and make sure that the customer is featured in the work that we do on understanding kind of what and making sure that the kind of the voice of the customer is held within that product development and service development.
So Hilti, what I found impressive, I think it was in 2013 or 2014 when I attended a presentation of one of your colleagues, and he showed a slide how Hilti maps the customer journey, and how Hilti has changed the view from being only Salesforce centric to being to being a more customer journey centric. So let's just wait until they're finished. Fuckers.
Ich hätte einfach nur warten müssen, bis wir dran sind. Ich hätte da gar nicht. Okay, sorry.
Kein Problem. So ist es halt im Showbiz. Let's show it. So one thing I found very impressive, it was in 2013 or 2014 when I attended a presentation of one of your colleagues, and he showed a slide how Hilti maps the customer journey from being, very direct sales centric and very sales rep centric to, seeing that customers have different touch points, and a lot of them are digital. And that was back in 2014. So from that perspective, how have you evolved in the last 3 years in that in that perspective?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I think Hilti has always been a very customer-centric company in the hardware development that they do. So they spend a lot of time learning, how people use our products and iterating based on feedback. But there's a big difference between how you do hardware development and software development, and that's where I think the learning has come for Hilti. And the first big major piece of hardware or software rather that we use is, of course, our e-commerce installations, infrastructure, and so on. And so the team, and I think it was probably one of my colleagues from the Hilti website team that was presenting this, they would have been looking at what does a purchaser in a large construction company, what are they looking for? What are their pains, and then how can we solve those? And Hilti prides itself on having 200,000 daily physical customer touchpoints. So that's in addition to all of the virtual touchpoints that we have via web, mobile, and customer service, chat, and phone calls. So those, so those touchpoints very much are reactive, right? So they come to us and then we react to them, and so the move is to kind of see where we can start to intercept those touch points with kind of or the customer with positive engagements. So how can we create micro moments on mobile that are preempting the customer having to come to us and say, hey, where's my order, by the way? So if we can then provide them with the information beforehand, it gives us a bit of a leg up. And so you can do that now, of course, with technology. And I think that's probably the big difference, is that we're no longer just saying, let's react to how customers want to engage with us, but we're saying, let's actually preemptively, let customers get the information that they need at the time that they need it.
So, in my experience, companies with a direct sales approach are usually, by nature, so to speak, more customer centric than sole distributors or then sole manufacturers without direct end customer contact. And I think it's fair to say that Hilti has already been known ever since as a company that is more customer centric than the industry average. So how do you manage it to become even more like to dive even more into that and to focus even more on the customer and probably track customer needs on a more granular level than on only by doing personas and being more like stereotypical.
Yeah, because I think a lot of the research around customers is it's still stuck in this kind of idea that let me do a survey and see what the customer wants, and that may provide you some way of discovering insights about the customer needs and what solutions you might want to build for them. But I think for us it's really about closing, or rather shortening, the feedback loops, and so rather than developing stuff and then waiting to go through kind of these long feedback loops where you ask the customer what they think of the product, why not build it into the product itself? And I think this is using a lot of modern kind of B2C concepts, and SaaS companies do this very well, is that they monitor the customer or the user usage, right? And so the A/B testing and so on allows you to basically kill off the features that people don't need, or improve the ones that you can see are clearly not or that are working, right? And it's, I think, for a lot of companies, creating that infrastructure to allow for A/B testing, to allow for these quick feedback loops, is the initial challenge. Once you've got it running, then you have kind of a well-oiled customer feedback and iterative, agile product development framework, and I think for that solves a little bit the product development problems. But then you also need to think, okay, well, what about on the innovation side? How do we actually come up with new ideas? Because it's one thing to create a product and have a lot of users and kind of evolve the product. It's another thing to come up with something from scratch. And so that's where also I think we're improving dramatically. We work with a lot of brilliant designers, both external and internal, that are really able to get into understanding what are the customer problems out there. How do we make sure to prioritize the ones that really matter, so that we can solve the big problems and build solutions that people will actually use, rather than waste resources on building everything that we think of.
I mean, to really operationalize that what you just explained, I think also from a technology standpoint, it's really important to have to add to the existing organization, right? So you can't all the process design steps and the iterations, you can't really build that on the legacy systems, nor you can build it or you can demand it from your existing core IT, because the last 50 years they had to follow a different approach. So how are you adding up to your existing organization to enable that?
Yeah, I think it's a bit of a shock to the organization to work kind of in this cross-functional way, where you want to work across different parts of the company with different skills and working with people that have come from potentially like a legacy kind of outsourcing commodity IT worldview towards these startup kids, these hipsters with skateboards and funny haircuts that somehow think that the world should be open and free and everyone should share everything, right? And I think that there's a little bit of clash there in terms of culture and so on. But the way that we've been handling that, and I think it hasn't been easy from the beginning, but I think you need to kind of take everyone on the journey, right? Get them involved at an early stage in developing these solutions. So I don't think there's necessarily a complete mismatch between the legacy systems and this iterative agile approach, but you do certainly need to make the effort to involve the legacy parts of the organizations in the decision making at an early stage, so that they're also part of building that solution, because that's where we see the most resistance, is if the solution is built in isolation by the funny haircut people, and then they come and say, by the way, we've built this solution, can you help us? And if you build it together, or have them somehow involved in it, and then have the funny haircut people maybe allow for that extra level of innovation, because from where they come from, this is normal. These like digital natives, or people that come from startups where they can build out features in a matter of hours, or they deploy multiple times a day. Things like that are concepts that are kind of a little bit foreign, I think, to the older parts of the organization. And so I think there's a lot of learning that has to happen. And I think what we find these days is that it's not always obvious to find someone that has that in between. You either have that kind of commodity IT mindset, or you come from the startup world, or you're really full MBA student that really doesn't know much about product development, or customer research and design, or UX design. So finding people that really are able to bridge that gap is really, I think, key for companies going forward. So being on one extreme or the other doesn't necessarily add a lot of value, just a lot of friction.
So it's success critical to really integrate both worlds at a very early point. So, but with that, I mean, this already excludes the idea that a lot of companies are following, in my opinion, and from the PR perspective that those companies are doing, say, we're founding a digital hub in London or in Berlin, and there all the digital magic is happening, and somehow we integrate it back, because I never heard a good answer, and somebody who had a really plan in place to say, how do we integrate that back, because that is the hardest part, not the crazy stuff with the funny haircut people, because they can produce a lot of crazy stuff if you want them to. So this already excludes this, right?
I think every company is different, and their needs are going to be different as well, because it's based really on a diverse set of kind of customers, and so they're going to do their research and come to different conclusions. But I think ultimately, being too far from the organization, potentially, if you're trying to reinvent a little bit or modernize your core business, may be a little bit difficult. I mean, it depends on how open is your data, right? Do you have external APIs? Do you have internal APIs that can be easily consumed? Like, I think if you don't create the infrastructure for those accelerators, those incubators, then you're unlikely to get a lot of benefit back to the core organization. I've seen a lot of examples of incubators and accelerators that aren't particularly successful, but PR-wise, it looks great, because company X is opening up to the startup world, and they're hiring a bunch of developers that are working on crazy moonshot ideas. But I think the problem is a lot of its incumbents aren't really understanding how they're going to then take that and bring it into their core business, or spin it off as a new product, or take some of that innovation, or even just incorporate those moonshot people into their organization. So they're kind of creating two separate worlds. And I think the real benefit of having these kind of innovation hubs is that the company should be able to learn. They should get something back from it. So I don't know what the solution is. I certainly think that it's maybe one step in the right direction. But if you go too far, I think that you risk actually alienating the part of your core business. So I think personally, I believe a lot in working to change the mindset within the core business towards a kind of a do it attitude. Like, here's a problem, let's just go ahead and build it. Let's work with the existing players. But at the same time, I think that there is the kind of that need to go into the moonshot, the Google X, the Daimler X, the Allianz X kind of territory as well. It's just it's really the devil is in the details.
But then there it's a different approach, right? So there it's more like really trying this crazy stuff, but that isn't necessarily to be integrated in the core system and in today's core business, right? So this is more like trying the crazy stuff and then sharing the experiences with others, and trying to be like one step ahead of time without losing a lot of money for big implementation projects that don't work at the end of the day.
Yeah.
But in general, would you say that getting back to the legacy IT versus the guy with the funny haircuts, well, there's a pretty good impression, I'd say. Coming from being a cost center and a CIO being incentivized on saving 1% of cost there and 2% of cost there, and being the great hero if you save 3% overall cost at the end of the year. Do you see the need of in general having another view on IT as more of a part of a profit center?
Yeah, I 100% agree. I think, and that's why I push for. I think it's like you kind of have to have, on the one hand, this integrated team of legacy and kind of startup and entrepreneurial innovation design mentality, and then on the other extreme, you do want to have something that's kind of separated from the core and able to in that that X example where you really are spinning off new business models. You're potentially even designing entirely new companies, entirely new entities. I think the fundamental issue is that, so to go into the IT question, I think that if they're trying to maintain reliability, and that's what they exist for, I think it's I think irresponsible to continue with that rhetoric, because you have to acknowledge that is not the only thing that IT does these days. I mean, IT provides productivity tools for employees. They provide software like Microsoft Teams or Slack, or and that's not just about reliability. That's about user experience. That's about how colleagues are able to interact and innovate, and so I think it should be part of the core competence of the IT organization to also look at internal productivity and innovation as part of their KPI, and then to take that and say, if we're going to build applications for customers, I think you also have to apply the same to IT, because they need to be incentivized. They need to be part of that innovation framework.
Do they also have to develop towards thinking more in business terms as well, and not just in IT implementation terms?
I believe that the two should be very closely mixed. You have this concept of the business guys are going to throw everything over the fence, and then the IT guys are going to go ahead and implement it. And I don't think that's how you build good solutions. I don't think that's how you build good applications or products or services. I think it should be more of a collaborative process. I think there's certain things where it's a very obvious implementation that maybe you can throw things over the fence, but when it comes to, I think, more innovative solutions where maybe it's new territory that people have not explored, or it's maybe outside of kind of the core repetitive business. I think there needs to be more of a collaborative approach. I definitely think so.
Yeah, and even sometimes, I mean, if you do the process right, the IT department has the better solution than just your idea of what the solution would be.
Yeah.
So the throwing over the fence, getting rid of the fence would probably be like the first step, very incremental step that everybody could do today, basically.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
So, I mean, I've seen in projects and throughout my time working for companies and corporates that it's the topic that you're obviously working on, or the topics, it's hard enough to implement that in one country, in one organization, but now you're the global head, so your troubles and challenges, they quadruple basically for you. How do you do that on a global scale?
I think you have to be very focused. I think trying to please every country or every customer in every market is going to lead to kind of a race to the bottom, right? So if you don't pilot small, focus on a core group of customers in a core geographic location, I don't think you're ever going to move forward with new innovative products. I think there's a responsibility for product teams to understand that they're not going to fix everything all in one. So like, having this kind of MVP mentality and really driving engagement with a small group of users is really important. I think the obvious example is when Yelp started out. I think they focused on 27-year-olds in the Mission District of San Francisco, and until they got the traction, they didn't want to expand beyond that. So I think this is just common knowledge in the startup kind of community, but I think in the corporate world, I think it seems that the literature is only just now catching up, and so McKinsey and the major management consulting companies are now kind of establishing that these are rules of how you should do business or how you should do product development or innovation. But I think it's been something that's just common sense in the startup or the VC world. So, but I'm excited to see how it works in the corporate world.
But how is it exact then for you guys at Hilti? Are you working on every continent, and you guys are on every continent, right? So are you working there in different initiatives on every continent, or are you working only on a few chosen countries on the same stuff? So how do you solve that?
Yeah, so I mean, depending on the product, we tend to kind of have obviously an individualized go-to-market. So, but often it'll involve one city or one country and one subset of a customer group, and the customer research and the product development happen very closely. So, in fact, we've done sessions where we were literally working from the job site, from a construction site, building an application or a feature with feedback from people on the construction site. It's not always logistically obvious to do that, but if you have the opportunity, if you have the relationship with the customer that allows you to do that, I think it's pretty essential, because you get that quick feedback immediately in the way that a startup would. I did a workshop in Berlin about a year and a half ago before I joined Hilti, where we brought engineers from a large aerospace company to Checkpoint Charlie, and we interviewed just random kind of tourists that were walking around Checkpoint Charlie, asking them, what they find. We had a certain design for an aircraft, and we were kind of getting feedback from them. And because this is a B2C company, or rather the end user was a consumer, we got pretty invaluable feedback that the engineers would have never gotten without some kind of large market research study and so on. And I think the emotional impact that it had on the engineers, more than just kind of the knowledge, because maybe they read that they've gotten feedback like that, but the emotional impact that it gave the engineers or the designers or whoever gets involved in these type of design thinking or product development workshops, I think that's really the key, because they take that back to the drawing board. They take it back to the Jira tickets they start writing, and then they really implement it because they have that emotional attachment. Because I don't think product development or solution development should be detached from, like, we try and call it, we like to think, I think a lot of large corporations like to think of product development or solution development as a science. And I think startups know that it's not a science. It's somewhere in between. It's an art and a science. And that emotional link for the developer or the designer, I think, is really important.
So, with you and you made a lot of comparisons to startups, which is I think highly influenced by your background, being a founder yourself in South Africa from a startup that basically does the same as Airbnb does for South Africa. So with your experience back there and now projected now for in today and into the future, what can or what as a corporate, what can you bring to the table to really benefit from probably also cooperation with startups and really have a steep learning curve and not just be a pain in the ass for the startups sitting around in their office producing zero value for the startups, but demanding a lot of teach us how to be agile. What do you have to do as a corporate?
Right. I mean, for us, the way that we think of startups is well, at least in our team, is, for us, they're another user, right? So we look at customers, we look at construction site managers, we look at engineers and architects and the type of people that Hilti services, and those are customers to us. So those are user for the products and services that we build. But we also need to look at startups, because I think they provide us with an aggregate view of of some of those customer groups, some of those personas, and they have a very deep understanding of them as well. So I think it would be arrogant to think that we can service all of our potential target audiences, considering how much in innovation startups are able to create. And so for us, we try and think of ways that we can interact with startups where we can support them. And I think for Hilti, it's still at an early stage with how we engage with startups, but we're very open to understanding better, how they're doing their solution development, where there's things that we can help them with. Obviously, operating in 120 countries, we've been around for about 75 years, and of course there is a lot of knowledge of this sector that I think startups do want to learn from. I think the obvious challenge for us is really how do we embed startups within our innovation framework? So specifically, what can we provide them, which is essentially your question. But I think coming from the startup world, the one thing that really has had a remarkable kind of impact on me is the sheer kind of size of an organization like Hilti. With 26,000 employees in 120 countries, you have distribution, you have R&D working on hardware development, you have all of these things that as a startup you don't really think about it. You don't have the resources. You're trying to bootstrap everything. You're trying to squeeze every last penny out of every last thing you're doing. And I think removing yourself a little bit, de-risk, or because you're constantly you're trying to avoid taking any risk, because you're not going to put all your eggs in one basket. And I think the nice luxury about being in a corporate is that you can also teach startups that sometimes it's worth taking the risk if you have the evidence to show that that you should. I think a lot of corporates obviously are very risk averse, but when they're ready to really make that leap, they can make a great impact. And so so for startups, I think it's really about having impact, or entrepreneurs that want to change the world. In our case of construction, engineering, and architecture, we provide that opportunity, and we'd like to be part of a framework or an ecosystem of companies that are really at the forefront of evolving this industry. And we're working now with a lot of partners at a global level that I think a lot of startups would find pretty fascinating. And so we're really, it's an open invitation to get in touch with us and have a chat, because I think there's a lot we can both learn from each other.
And there is a growing number of construction startups, right? So there are a lot of startups looking into how can we digitalize and transform construction sites and everything that surrounds it. Johann, it was a great pleasure having you here now that it starts raining and we are approaching the de Mexico again. Thank you very much for your time.
Thanks.
Really appreciate it. Lots of success at Hilti, digitalizing the construction industry, challenging the industry, pushing it forward. I think they are lucky to have guys like you and the guys in your team. So looking forward to see your development. Thank you very much.
Cool. Thanks.